Housing is both a use value and an exchange value. And the most important thing is that people get adequate access to housing as a use value. We are told that in order to do that, we should go through a market system and let the exchange value system take care of it. The exchange value system has failed. It's failed miserably.
New York City has a lot of vacant property, and we have people sleeping on the street, sleeping in trains, sleeping in shelters, living double and triple up on top of each other when they don't need to. Real estate people in the city will tell you there's not enough supply for the demand, and they're lying. When you're walking down the street, you walk past Duane Reade, look up. You'll see a 3- or 4-story apartment building boarded up because the landlord can make all of his money on the ground floor in 2 months. And the next 10 months is all profit in his pocket.
Housing has always been a central feature of a capitalist economy. Over time, of course, it's become even more important. And housing has actually taken on a variety of roles, including just as a use value of a house, but also as a form of saving for people. And increasingly over the last 30 years, of course, it's become a vehicle of speculation.
In New York City, because of the increasing rents and the unaffordability of housing for the majority of the population, people tend to move into spaces that swiftly become overcrowded. They utilize any available space that they can to create a livable space. It can be in a basement, it could be in some extra rooms in someone's house and so forth. It could be in an abandoned vacant house.
We counted the top 20 community boards in the city as of 2011 with the most vacancies per square mile. And in those 20 community boards, which was across the 5 boroughs, we found enough space to potentially house 199,981 people. So you still have 39 community boards to count.
3 times more vacant spaces in New York City than there are homeless people. 3 times more vacant spaces in New York than there are homeless people in New York City.
I think it's very interesting to go around and look at how many of those buildings have lights on in the evening. And when you look, you actually see some of them are quite dark, which says that nobody's actually living there. So you have a unit, condominium with, I don't know, 400 units, and only 5 of them have any lights on, and you kind of say, well, obviously the others are not being used for housing. They're being used simply as warehousing for their speculative funds, which they've invested in purchasing the house, and all they're going to do is wait for the market to go up, and then they'll sell out.
Sometimes speculators can buy land and they can sit on it for 1, 5, 10 years, 20, 30 years, or even longer. And this has an enormous effect on the everyday lives of people. People who live and work in neighborhoods have to look at empty buildings, at empty lots, and who could use that space and use that land could be used for a public purpose, but it's sitting basically in somebody's, as if it were in somebody's bank account.
So what will occur is that people will convert those spaces, which may in fact involve them in some kinds of illegal activities, into housing that they can afford and to live in, which would mean that someone goes into a vacant house. They're going into that vacant house because they don't have any other possibility to create a house. They use their physical abilities. They use what we refer to as sweat equity, as opposed to the financial equity that they lack, in order to create spaces for themselves.
So if you go to many cities of the world, I mean, you'll find a deficit of affordable housing for the mass of the population in the midst of a surplus of housing for the upper classes.
A lot of the addresses we found, they're hiding behind LLCs, and although you're supposed to list who owns the LLC, at least the board, what they're getting away with is a P.O. box for mailing and the name of the treasurer who writes the tax checks. So in order to find out who's at the top, you need to know someone who can get through the maze and get past the treasurer, the accountant, and up to the top. We have enough housing in the city so no one needs to be homeless. And what we need to do is get together whether we have a home or not and push these people into opening up all of these properties. And when you do that, they won't be able to charge you $3,000 for a shoebox they call a studio apartment. Elders will be able to have assisted living or affordable housing. They won't be living in shelters, won't be living with children, won't be living doubled up with family or friends. The city has enough housing, and we need to open it up and all of us live comfortably.
You could walk down any given street, and I mean even a Fifth Avenue in New York, which is probably one of the wealthiest streets in the world, and there's a homeless person sitting on a bench right next to a guy that's running a multi-billion-dollar corporation. For me, having been somebody that has gone through shelter, I think one of the biggest problems when you look at the issue of homelessness is how it's talked about in broad strokes in this country. So you're homeless because you have mental illness. You're homeless because you have chemical addiction. You're homeless because you're an alcoholic. You're homeless because you don't want to work. You're homeless because you don't have any education. For me, that was a problem. I don't have chemical addiction. I'm not an alcoholic. I do have a work history. I had a 30-year work history before I went homeless. I have a college education. I'm sure there are hundreds of other people like me. So I think as long as we use that narrative, we're going to have problems. We're going to have a social problem with homelessness in this country. So we need to socially think differently about how we describe this particular issue. It's a social ill that we have to look at as a societal problem, not an individual problem.
When the homeless crisis occurred in the late 70s, early 1980s, and the right to shelter legislation was passed, which allowed for a conversion of the use of barrack-style spaces, in other words, large, vacant, gymnasium-style spaces, to put lots of cots in and so forth. That created the shelter industry at that point in the form of these large barracks and so forth. That had been illegal up to that point.
One thing that's often forgotten about this whole issue is women and children, and to the effect that they are in shelters and the numbers are staggering. There are about 22,000 children on any given night in a shelter, and probably about 18,000 moms.
A landlord, for instance, will take one apartment and make a contract with the Department of Homeless Services, and maybe has 12 apartments in that building, and convert each of those apartments into habitation for 4, 6, or 8 men. So you have conversions that take place within the homeless industrial complex in New York City, which also the consequence is that massive profit making on the part of these landlords. Because you could imagine where they were having rent from one family in one apartment, now they're getting the equivalent of, let's say, $1,500 to $2,000 per head per apartment. So that's why we have close to $1 billion a year homeless industry in New York City, supposedly meeting the sheltering needs, not the housing needs of people or the privacy needs of people or anything having to do with that, the sheltering needs of the sheltering industry.
The main piece is people are homeless because they don't have a home. Homes are built on land. So how do you acquire land? Land in this city has become a huge commodity, but the fact that land is at such a premium makes it difficult. So some of those alternatives could be community land trusts, land banks, ways to put set-asides of land to build that housing that poor and low-income people need, and take that money away that you're pouring into the shelter infrastructure.
Take that $1 billion and move it into a process of renovating these vacant spaces with and in behalf of homeless people, and solve the homeless crisis like that and have money left over.
You cannot end homelessness by attacking it by giving people temporary places to stay. People are homeless because they need a home, a permanent place to live.
What I think is important to understand is in New York, your landlord is not really probably a landlord. Your landlord is probably a financial institution. It is probably a private equity firm. It is probably a hedge fund. It is probably getting financing from some of the major Wall Street banks. And your apartment is almost certainly just a number on a spreadsheet. And that's a direction that unless we fight back, we're going to see housing go across the country. But here that's a reality that we've lived for a very long time, and it's made this city one of the most difficult cities to live in the entire world. Across the country, again, we saw millions of foreclosures, which means millions of homes, between 4 and 5 million, possibly more, are just standing vacant and being held onto by banks. There was the prevailing idea that we had to foreclose on those families. We had to get them out, evict them. We had to turn these homes over to the banks, and then we had to turn them back over to families in order to restabilize housing prices in the housing market. And that we had to go through this glut supposedly of foreclosures in order to get to the next step, which would be more equitable housing, which would be a restabilized market in which homes values are lower. So that's not what we're seeing at all.
What struck me after the crisis unfolded was how little the government actually did directly to clear up the mess in the housing market. I mean, my view at the time was that the government should step in, should take over all of the foreclosed housing, as much as possible keep people living in them, reduce the value of the mortgages and turn it into some sort of collective property neighborhood revival strategy or something of that kind. They didn't try any of this. They simply bailed out the banks. That as housing prices crashed after the foreclosure, this was a moment when many investors could get in and just buy up very, very cheaply. So we suddenly find a lot of hedge funds and you know, other corporations and some collections of individuals buying up massively the foreclosed housing.
And so these large equity investment companies, these massive global portfolios, we're talking about billion-dollar investment companies, you know, based in New York, but also based in France and Switzerland and points in Europe. And so basically these companies would invest in these properties, buy the properties with the expectation that they would be able to kick out all of the under market rate tenants and be able to replace them with far above market rate tenants, right? So this was happening in mass numbers throughout the city in completely unchecked, unregulated, aggressive capitalism that was preying on the sort of weakest members of our communities.
Once they went bankrupt, then the housing ownership went to the bank, and the bank was not going to do anything. So we had people living in these big blocks who weren't getting heating because the heating system had broken down, but nobody was going to fix it because who's the owner?
And, you know, to distill it, what we've seen is skyrocketing rent prices, an incredible number of illegal evictions, and really a just outstandingly abusive practice of tenant harassment being pretty much the norm in the city.
So a new landlord takes over a building and they say, well, I'm going to see if I can buy tenants out. I'm going to see if I can harass tenants out. I'll do construction in the building and maybe the tenants will just give up. I'll see if I can bring fraudulent cases against them and see if they'll just stop and give up. I'll bring eviction cases and maybe I'll negotiate something with them because I'll get them tired. So they can spend money and time, landlords, to try to get tenants out, and tenants just can't take up time from work. They can't continue to fight, so at some point they give up.
Again, this is an example of what you might call sort of creative destruction going on in the housing market, and it's predatory practices going on in the housing market in which companies move in and they actually rip everything off and rob people effectively. then they go bankrupt and they leave, leaving people in desperate situations.
We interviewed this elderly couple, and the landlord had actually cut like a new bathroom upstairs, and so there was like raw sewage coming down one of their walls. So when you walked in, the smell was like mold and water, and it smelled like sewage, and they were living in that, and literally had recently gone to the hospital because it was affecting them so much. We knew that if anyone saw what they were living in, that they weren't going to be able to live there anymore because it wasn't habitable. And so we talked to them, and they ended up wanting, to move to a shelter. But that's where they had to go because they were just being forced by their landlord, who just wanted to make a buck. He wanted to make more money.
This city is also one of the hotbeds of housing activism, and it always has been. We have rent stabilization laws because across the Lower East Side, women younger than me, immigrants from across Eastern Europe, said, it doesn't matter that I'm 16 and I don't speak a word of English, but I refuse to pay my rent. I'm going to fight back against this. We have tenant laws because people in the Bronx and people in Harlem fought back and catalyzed not just a housing movement, but also civil rights movement across the country. And we're seeing that again starting to happen in New York.
We're asking you to hold all the sails right now. We're going to survive, but we don't know how. This is auctioning all the people need.
New York City is a remarkable place, unfortunately a dramatically unequal one. We've got a small number of people who make a lot of money from all around the world, and a much larger number of people whose incomes are flat and who don't make anywhere near enough to afford the cost of housing. Meanwhile, the cost of housing has risen dramatically in recent years, even as the incomes of most New Yorkers are flat or even declining.
40% of people in New York are living at or below poverty, and the number of affordable housing units nowhere near meet the demand. In addition, the people who are already living in affordable housing and rent-stabilized housing are being pushed out left and right by landlords. They're using whatever tools and campaigns available to them to try to displace them.
This city is known as the real estate capital of the world, and for good reason. Developers are much more prioritized than your average New Yorker.
And since the real estate industry is the largest single donor to election campaigns, they have a lot to say about who sits in the offices that make the decisions about development. Zoning is a public action that increases the value of land, and it can do so overnight. And after the zoning action, then landowners can benefit enormously. They profit enormously, and they can resell their land.
New York requires a diversity of land use to meet our needs, and high-end luxury development and zoning that allows for that does not meet New Yorkers' needs.
So the most important tool for providing housing for really truly low-income people is public housing, is New York City Housing Authority. That's 175,000 units that has people down at 30% of area median income or even lower.
But we've seen the federal government defund federal public housing. So we could get federal, state, and city funds to support our public housing. There are serious repair problems in public housing, and government isn't doing anything. On the state level, the state supports a rent regulatory system called rent regulation. It regulates the rents that keep people in communities. However, over the last 20 years, we've seen a real weakening of those laws.
We've seen a shift in policies that really caters to private developers and how much money can be made on the use of land as opposed to repurposing and using land for the benefit of people.
The very rich condominiums here in New York City, they're not taxed at the same rate as everybody else. There's some deal which was cut years ago to help the real estate industry recover, and it's never been taken away. So there are all these distortions between supply and demand. On the supply side, we find another distortion, which is what would developers rather do? Build affordable housing or build high-end condominiums for very rich people?
It really depends whether the program is voluntary or mandatory. In a mandatory program, you dampen the cost of land values a little bit and require people to include affordable housing as part of the price of making money by building new housing. In a voluntary program, which is what we have in New York City, you're basically offering the developer to build more market rate housing in exchange for making some of that affordable, and the developers conclude in some cases that it's worth the extra market rate housing they can build. The problem is in a lot of cases developers haven't taken the deal. They've said, I'm perfectly happy to build this much market rate housing and I'll just go ahead and do that and not build any affordable housing as part of the program.
Well, there's much more profit to be had from the high-end condominiums, so they tend to want to build those and not to do affordable housing.
We need to mandate affordable housing. We need to have a mandatory inclusionary zoning program. If we have tax credits, they shouldn't be gone in 20 and 30 years. Bloomberg and the former mayor of the city of New York touted that we built, or preserved 165,000 units of affordable housing. However, only 3% of those units are permanently affordable. So yes, he spent $7 billion to build affordable housing, but the question is, how long are those affordable for and affordable for whom?
And of course, inclusionary housing is taking place in communities where the market has been driving development and gentrification's been taking place, so people are seeing more affordable units lost than created.
The future of affordability for New York depends on how hard people are willing to fight for it.
Mobilize no more! It takes roots to weather the storm!
You either own your home or you rent a property, and that's how Americans and New Yorkers understand housing. For us, there's a whole range of other things that exist. Cooperatives, community land trusts, things that are really about shared ownership and shared responsibility for the space, whether that be a single-family home or a high-rise building. We are of the belief that there are many other iterations and versions of housing yet to be seen, or some that exist other places that would work just fine in this country if people really got a taste for how they move, how they function, and could develop an understanding that moving away from the market system is the only solution to actually making sure that there is housing for every, human being in the country. So in New York, we have a cultural shift that has to happen in our hearts and in our minds. I live in the belly of the beast, New York City, where people are throwaways, but buildings and architecture and profits are prized possessions. And if we are not able to shift that culture on its head, we're in a lot of trouble. All of us, not just poor people, but the billionaires and the millionaires are in a lot of trouble too.
In the final analysis, the most important thing is that everybody should have access to decent housing, and that to me is a human right, not something that should be legislated and regulated through market exchange.